The cab's digital dashboard read 12 the Grauais when Marcus Rodriguez answered his last call that January night in Cleveland. The normally busy streets of the hospital district were practically deserted due to the heavy snowfall that had punished the city for more than 6 hours. While other drivers had already finished their shifts, Marcus remained firmly behind the wheel of his yellow Crown Victoria Model 2015, following a principle he had inherited from his father. There's always someone who needs help, especially on the toughest nights. Marcus had no idea that this seemingly routine call would completely change the course of his life. As he pulled up in front of the address on Euclid Avenue, he saw an elderly woman trying to balance herself on the slippery sidewalk. Without hesitating, he got out of the car, ignoring the biting wind that made his bones ache. "Ma'am, please let me help you," said Marcus, offering support to the woman who introduced herself as Dorothy Wilson. Her snow-white hair was partially covered by a navy blue wool cap, and her trembling hands held a weathered cane. "I need to go to Cleveland Medical Center, young man," said Dorothy, her voice weak but determined. "It's an emergency." During the drive, Marcus watched through the rearview mirror the expressions of pain that Dorothy tried to disguise. The traffic was dangerously slow due to the snow that was piling up, turning the streets into ice rinks. While driving with extreme caution, Marcus began to worry that the cost of the ride would rise considerably due to the adverse conditions. "Mrs. Wilson, I know the road is difficult and the fare is going up. Don't worry about it, I'll give you—" "A fair price," said Marcus, breaking the tense silence that had settled in the vehicle. Dorothy smiled slightly, her blue eyes shining with a wisdom that Marcus couldn't decipher. "Your concern is very kind, Mr. Rodriguez, but I assure you that money is no object." When they arrived at the hospital, Marcus insisted on accompanying Dorothy to reception, even though he knew it would mean missing out on possible races. To his surprise, the receptionist greeted Dorothy with unusual familiarity, something he mentally stored away as curious, but didn't question. "How much do I owe you, Mr. Rodriguez?" asked Dorothy, already seated in a wheelchair brought by a nurse. Marcus looked at the meter, which read $75.50, a considerable amount for a relatively short ride. "Ms. Wilson, considering the circumstances, $40 is fine." Dorothy arched her eyebrows, visibly surprised at the discount being offered. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Marcus replied simply. "Besides, my mother always said that kindness breeds kindness." What Marcus didn't know was that those simple, sincere words were being carefully recorded by discreet cameras installed in his cab, part of an elaborate social survey conducted by Dorothy Wilson herself, one of the most influential businesswomen in Ohio's health sector. The next morning, while Marcus was having his usual breakfast at Joe's Diner, a man in an impeccable suit sat down in front of him. "Mr. Rodriguez, my name is Richard Palmer. I'm Mrs. Dorothy Wilson's lawyer. She would like to talk to you about a job offer." Marcus almost choked on his coffee. "Dorothy Wilson, the lady from last night?" "Exactly," confirmed Palmer, handing him a card with the address of Wilson Healthcare Network's head office. "She's the owner of one of the largest hospital chains in the region, and your attitude last night impressed her deeply." The next few hours passed like a blur for Marcus. In a meeting room on the 40th floor of one of Cleveland's most imposing buildings, Dorothy Wilson, now dressed in an elegant navy blue ensemble, explained her project, a free medical transportation program for needy seniors. "Mr. Rodriguez, your compassion and professionalism are exactly what we're looking for," said Dorothy. "We want you to lead this program. Your experience as a taxi driver combined with your humanity is invaluable." Marcus was silent for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of the proposal. In his 15 years as a taxi driver, he had witnessed countless stories of people struggling to get adequate medical transportation, especially the elderly. "There's something else you need to know," Dorothy continued, her tone becoming more serious. "During our research, we discovered some irregularities in the current medical transportation system. We suspect a fraud scheme involving ambulance companies that overbill the government." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. It wasn't just a transport program that was at stake, but an opportunity to do justice and help vulnerable people who were being exploited by the system. "When do we start?" asked Marcus, his determination clear in his voice. Dorothy smiled, satisfied with the answer. "Immediately. But be prepared, Mr. Rodriguez. What started as a cab ride on a blizzardy night could end up revealing a lot, more than we realize." As he watched the snow continue to fall on the other side of the office window, Marcus realized that his life had changed forever. The taxi driver who had always prided himself on knowing every street in Cleveland was now preparing to navigate much more complex and challenging territory. Marcus's first week as director of Wilson Healthcare Network's new medical transportation program was a true immersion into a world he barely knew. His assigned office on the 38th floor offered a panoramic view of Cleveland, but his gaze was fixed on the documents scattered across his desk. Financial reports, ambulance company records, and anonymous testimonials from elderly patients. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," explained Sandra Chen, a forensic analyst assigned by Dorothy to assist Marcus. Her nimble fingers glided across the keyboard as she presented comparative cost graphs. "In the last 3 years, there has been a 300% increase in ambulance service charges to Medicare in our region." Marcus frowned, remembering the countless elderly people he had met in his cab over the years, many choosing to risk a cheaper fare even in emergency situations. "How can they justify these figures?" "Systematic overcharging," Sandra replied, adjusting her black-frame glasses. "They charge for equipment that has never been used record longer distances than the real ones classify simple transports as highly complex emergencies." The program Dorothy had envisioned was beginning to take shape. Marcus led a team of 20 carefully selected drivers, all trained in first aid and sensitized to caring for the elderly. Each vehicle was equipped with cameras and GPS not just for safety's sake, but to build an accurate database on the real needs for medical transportation in the region. One afternoon, while reviewing the previous day's recordings, Marcus noticed something peculiar. The same patient, 78-year-old Gerald Thompson, appeared on the records of 3 different ambulance companies on the same day, supposedly for 3 different appointments at different hospitals. "Sandra, is that possible?" Marcus called out to his colleague, pointing at the screen. "Not without a DeLorean," she replied wryly. "And here's the most interesting thing, all 3 companies belong to the same group, Midwest Medical Transport Solutions." The discovery prompted Marcus to investigate further. Over the next few weeks, he and Sandra mapped out an intricate scheme that involved falsifying documents, double billing, and even ghost patients, people who supposedly used the service but who in reality didn't even exist. Dorothy Wilson followed the progress with meticulous attention. In a private meeting, she revealed to Marcus that her own mother had been the victim of a similar scam years before, which motivated her to start this secret investigation. "My mother died believing that she had left an astronomical debt to me because of fraudulent transportation charges," Dorothy confided, her normally firm voice trembling slightly. "I found out later that half of the services charged for never happened." The free transport program was beginning to annoy the fraudsters. Marcus began to receive anonymous calls with veiled threats. One day he found the tires of his institutional van flat in the hospital parking lot. "We're dealing with powerful people," warned Richard Palmer, Dorothy's lawyer, during an emergency meeting. "But we're also building a solid case. The FBI has already shown interest in the evidence we've collected." Marcus knew he was at a point of no return. The stories of the elderly people his program helped on a daily basis, like Mrs. Martinez, who was finally able to get her chemotherapy without spending her savings on transportation, or Mr. Johnson, who no longer had to choose between buying his medication or paying for an ambulance, gave him the certainty that he was on the right track. One evening, while organizing the last reports of the day, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. It was Carl Blackwood, CEO of Midwest Medical Transport Solutions, accompanied by 2 men in suits. "Mr. Rodriguez," began Blackwood with an artificial smile, "I've come to personally propose a partnership. Your operation is impressive, and I believe we could work together very profitably." Marcus kept his expression neutral, conscious of the security camera installed in his office. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Blackwood, but our program has a very specific mission to serve, not to profit." Itor. Blackwood's smile disappeared. "Think about it, Rodriguez. Cleveland is a big city, but it can get very small for those who don't know how to play the game." After the unwelcome visitors had left, Marcus received a message from Dorothy. "We've recorded everything. It's time to move on to the next phase." Blackwood's visit was the missing catalyst. The next morning, FBI agents discreetly occupied a room on the same floor as Marcus's office, officially launching a federal investigation that promised to expose one of the largest healthcare fraud schemes in Ohio history. What began as an act of kindness on a blizzard night was about to turn into an avalanche that would sweep away decades of corruption in the medical transportation system. And Marcus Rodriguez, the taxi driver who always wanted to make a difference, was at the epicenter of this storm. The FBI set up a discreet operations room on the same floor as Marcus's office, transforming the 38th floor into a camouflaged investigation center. Special Agent Robert Callahan, a 25-year veteran of healthcare fraud cases, led the operation with the same surgical precision that characterized his career. "We're dealing with a sophisticated organization," Callahan explained, spreading out documents on the meeting table. "Midwest Medical Transport Solutions is just the visible tip of a pyramid of shell companies and oranges." Marcus and Sandra watched intently as the agent connected the dots on a complex diagram on the wall. Red lines connected company names, executives, and suspicious transactions, forming a pattern that resembled a spider's web. "What worries me most are the insiders," Callahan continued, his voice low and controlled. "We have reason to believe that there are employees within the hospitals themselves facilitating the scheme." Dorothy Wilson, who was following the meeting via video conference from her office in Chicago, intervened. "That's why we need to expand Marcus's program immediately. The more data we collect, the harder it will be for them to hide their activities." The expansion of the program brought new challenges. Marcus began recruiting more drivers, but the selection process was rigorous. Each candidate underwent extensive background checks and interviews conducted personally by him. One of the new drivers, James Mitchell, caught Marcus's eye because of his personal history. A former paramedic, Mitchell had blown the whistle on wrongdoing at his old ambulance company, and as a result was fired and placed on an informal industry blacklist. "They have a system," Mitchell explained during his first day. "They classify stable patients as critical, record the use of advanced life support equipment when only basic transport was needed. It's a well-oiled machine." The investigation took a new turn when Sandra discovered a pattern in the fraudulent charges. "Look at this," she showed Marcus, pointing to her laptop. "The scam companies always schedule unnecessary transportation for seniors in the first few weeks of the month right after Medicare benefits are deposited. The free transportation program began to directly affect the fraudsters' profits. In just 2 months, Marcus and his team carried out more than 2,000 legitimate transports, saving the public health system millions of dollars. The criminals' response didn't take long. One morning, Marcus found his office ransacked with files scattered all over the floor. Nothing had been stolen, but the message was clear: they were being watched. "We need to be more careful," warned Dorothy during an emergency meeting. "They're getting desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." The mistake came in the form of a more direct bribery attempt. Carl Blackwood sent one of his executives, Michael Preston, to make Marcus a substantial offer, $5 million, to restructure the transportation program in a more efficient way. Marcus recorded the entire conversation following the FBI's instructions. Preston, unaware that he was being monitored, inadvertently revealed crucial details about the scheme, including the names of hospital employees involved. "We have doctors, administrators, even a regional Medicare director on our payroll," Preston boasted. "It's a perfect system, Mr. Rodriguez. Why not be a part of it?" Marcus's refusal triggered a series of events that no one could have predicted. That same evening, Sandra received an anonymous email containing internal documents from Midwest Medical Transport Solutions. The sender identified himself only as Clean Conscience. "Someone on the inside wants to talk," concluded Agent Callahan, examining the files. "This could be our chance to dismantle the whole operation." The documents revealed an even bigger scheme than they suspected. In addition to transport fraud, the organization was involved in an elaborate system of overcharging for medicals, equipment, and medicines. Dorothy Wilson decided to step up the pressure. Through her network of hospitals, she began to cancel contracts with companies suspected of taking part in the scheme. The reaction was immediate. Veiled threats began to reach not only Marcus, but also other members of the team. "We can't back down now," Marcus insisted during a tense meeting with his team. "Every elderly person we help is living proof that we're on the right track." The investigation entered a new phase when James Mitchell recognized one of the names in the leaked documents, his former supervisor at the ambulance company, Rachel Morrison, now held a senior position in the regional Medicare administration. "She was the missing link," Mitchell explained. "Morrison approved every suspicious charge without question." The FBI began to mount an operation to expose the connection between Morrison and the fraud scheme. Marcus and his team would be key players, continuing their normal work while collecting crucial evidence for the case. The tension grew by the day, but Marcus found strength in the stories of the elderly people his program was helping. Like that of Helen Cooper, a 92-year-old woman who was finally able to resume her dialysis treatment thanks to the free transportation. "You're not just taking us to hospitals," said Helen, holding Marcus's hand after a trip. "You're giving us back our dignity." As the investigation deepened, Marcus began to understand that he had stumbled upon something much bigger than a simple local scam. It was a corrupt system that was spreading throughout the country, sucking vital resources out of the health system. The issue now was no longer just exposing the criminals, but also protecting those who had decided to do the right thing. Marcus knew that the next steps would be crucial, not only for the success of the investigation, but for the very survival of the program that had become his life's mission. The discovery of Rachel Morrison's connection to the fraud scheme accelerated events dramatically. The FBI, under the coordination of Agent Callahan, set up a discreet surveillance operation on the regional Medicare administrator, revealing an intricate network of clandestine meetings and suspicious bank transfers. "She meets Carl Blackwood every Thursday at the Riverside Country Club," reported James Mitchell, who kept valuable contacts from his days as a paramedic. "Always at 3 p.m., always at table 23, always ordering extra dry martini." Marcus and Sandra transformed an abandoned room on the 38th floor into a makeshift monitoring center. Maps covered the walls, connected by red wires linking people, places, and events. In the center, a screen displayed the movements of the transport program's vans, in real time, each blue dot representing a life being positively impacted. "We need something concrete," insisted Agent Callahan, studying the latest reports. "Recordings, signed documents, something they can't deny in court." The opportunity came unexpectedly when Dorothy Wilson received an anonymous phone call. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a former employee of Midwest Medical Transport Solutions, Jennifer Reese, who could no longer bear the burden of guilt. "I have records of all the fraudulent transactions from the last 5 years, Jennifer revealed, her voice shaking. "Blackwood keeps everything on a private server, but I made backups before I was fired." The meeting with Jennifer took place in a busy cafe in downtown Cleveland. Marcus, accompanied by undercover FBI agents, listened intently as she described how the scheme worked down to the smallest detail. "Rachel Morrison isn't just an accomplice," Jennifer explained, sliding a flash drive across the table. "She's the architect of the whole system. It was she who developed the algorithm that determines which patients would be targeted for fraudulent charges." The data on the USB stick was devastating. Thousands of elderly people had been exploited, some charged, for up to 12 ambulance transports in a single day. The loss to public coffers exceeded $100 million in the state of Ohio alone. Meanwhile, the free transportation program continued to grow. Marcus expanded the operation to include a post-transport follow-up system where volunteers called seniors to make sure they had received adequate care. "We're building more than a transportation service," Marcus explained during a meeting with his team. "We're creating a safety net for the most vulnerable." The pressure on the fraudsters was mounting. Rachel Morrison started making mistakes, approving increasingly absurd charges in her rush to maximize profits before everything collapsed. It was one of these mistakes that provided the loophole the FBI needed. She authorized an emergency transport charge for a patient who had already died. Sandra revealed her hands shaking as she showed Marcus the documents. "And it wasn't an isolated case. We found dozens of similar charges." Dorothy Wilson, on being informed of the new findings, took a risky decision. She set up a meeting with the Medicare Board of Directors, presenting preliminary evidence of the scheme without revealing the ongoing investigation. "We need to act before they realize we're closing in," Dorothy argued in a video conference with Marcus and Agent Callahan. "If we wait too long, they could destroy crucial evidence." The plan was audacious. The free transportation program would be expanded dramatically, offering services in areas where the fraudulent companies were most active. The sudden drop in revenue would force criminals into more desperate and consequently more reckless actions. Jennifer Reese agreed to use her insider knowledge to help with the operation, even though she knew the personal risks involved. "They've already taken 5 years off my life," she said. "I'm not going to let them keep destroying the lives of innocent people." The tension reached its peak when Rachel Morrison, feeling cornered, tried to negotiate her surrender. Through intermediaries, she offered to hand over documents implicating high-ranking government officials in exchange for immunity. "We can't trust her," warned James Mitchell. "Morrison is an expert at manipulating situations in her favor." Marcus watched the city through his office window, reflecting on how a simple cab ride on a blizzardy night had turned into an operation that could change the American healthcare system. The weight of responsibility was immense, but with every elderly person his program helped, he was sure he was on the right track. The investigation was about to enter its most dangerous phase. With enough evidence to bring down the main people involved, it was time to tighten the noose. But Marcus knew that cornered criminals were the most dangerous, and the real battle was just beginning. The FBI operation entered its most critical phase when Rachel Morrison, in a desperate attempt to save her own skin, began sending compromising documents anonymously to different investigative bodies. It was a tactic calculated to create chaos and confusion, spreading partial information that could compromise years of careful investigation. "She's playing a dangerous game," warned Agent Callahan during an emergency meeting. "Morrison is trying to create so many loose ends that it will be impossible to tie everything together into a cohesive case." Marcus, who had witnessed the scheme's devastating impact firsthand through his transportation program, knew they couldn't let Morrison dictate the pace of the investigation. Together with Sandra, he spent entire evenings organizing a detailed timeline that connected each leaked document with evidence already collected. "Look at this," said Sandra, pointing to a series of bank transfers. "Every time Morrison approved a batch of fraudulent charges, a company in the Cayman Islands received a deposit equivalent to 15% of the total amount." The discovery led to an unexpected twist. The offshore company belonged not just to Blackwood or Morrison, but to a consortium of health sector executives, including 3 directors of major hospitals in the region. The scheme was much bigger than initially suspected. Dorothy Wilson, who was following developments closely, took a risky decision. She called an extraordinary meeting of the board of her network of hospitals, presenting carefully selected evidence that would not compromise the federal investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dorothy began, her firm voice echoing through the meeting room, "our healthcare system is being systematically looted by people who swore to protect it." The reaction was immediate. While some counselors demanded immediate action, others showed a suspicious discomfort. Marcus, observing the meeting by video conference, particularly noticed the nervous reaction of Howard Phillips, one of the longest-serving members of the board. Jennifer Reese, who continued to provide vital information for the investigation, identified Phillips in several compromising emails. He was the direct contact with the politicians, she revealed. Phillips ensured that any internal investigation was quickly shelved. The free shuttle program, now operating with 50 vehicles, had become not only an essential service, but a vital investigative tool. Each driver was trained to discreetly document any irregularities observed in the hospitals or clinics they served. "We're building a crime map in real time," Marcus explained to his team. "Every patient we transport, every conversation we hear, every document we photograph brings us closer to the truth." The pressure began to have an effect. Howard Phillips, feeling cornered, tried to contact Marcus through intermediaries. He wanted to negotiate, offering information about politicians involved in the scheme in exchange for leniency. "We can't make individual deals," insisted Agent Callahan. "We need the whole organization from top to bottom." The situation reached a critical point when Jennifer Reese was found unconscious in her apartment. There were no signs of forced entry, but a half-eaten cup of coffee contained traces of powerful sleeping pills. "They're sending a message," said James Mitchell while visiting Jennifer in hospital. "They want us to know that no one is safe." The attempt to silence Jennifer had the opposite effect to that intended. Dorothy Wilson immediately moved her and her family to a secure location, and the incident only strengthened the team's resolve to expose the whole scheme. Marcus implemented new safety protocols for his team of drivers. Each van was equipped with panic buttons, and additional cameras and transportation routes were changed at random to avoid predictable patterns. "We can't let fear paralyze us," Marcus said during a meeting with his team. "Every elderly person we help is a victory against this corrupt system." The investigation got a new boost when Sandra discovered a connection between the shell companies used in the scam and a series of rehabilitation clinics that existed only on paper. "They weren't just defrauding transportation," she explained, showing Marcus the documents. "They were creating entire patients with false medical histories and treatments that never happened." The siege was closing in, but the investigators knew they had to act with caution. One false move could not only compromise the operation, but endanger the lives of crucial witnesses, and more importantly, the elderly who depended on the transportation program. As the snow began to fall again over Cleveland, Marcus watched from his office window as the blue dots moved across the digital map, each representing a van from the program, each carrying not only patients, but also the hope of justice in a system that had long been corrupted. The real battle was just beginning, and the price of the truth would be high, but Marcus knew there was no turning back. The snow that now covered the city reminded him of that fateful night with Dorothy Wilson, and how a simple act of kindness had turned into a crusade for justice. The FBI operation to dismantle the fraud scheme entered its decisive phase on a freezing February morning. Marcus received an urgent call from Jennifer Reese, still recovering in the secure hospital. "They're destroying documents. A massive cleanup operation has begun at Midwest Medical's offices." Within minutes, the 38th floor was transformed into a makeshift command center. Agent Callahan coordinated tactical teams over the phone, while Sandra worked furiously to remotely access the company's servers before crucial data was deleted. "We have warrants for all the main sites," Callahan informed her, his voice tense but controlled. "But we need to synchronize operations perfectly. If one site is alerted too early, we lose everything." Dorothy Wilson, connected by emergency video conference, took advantage of the situation to make her own strategic move. She called an extraordinary meeting of the hospital board, ensuring that all the suspects would be in one place when the operation began. "You have been summoned to discuss the future of our medical transportation system." Dorothy began, her calm voice masking the tension of the moment. Howard Phillips fidgeted uncomfortably in his chair, constantly checking his cell phone. At 10:47, just as Sandra managed to preserve a mirror copy of Midwest Medical's servers, the FBI teams began simultaneous actions in 12 different locations. The timing was crucial. Every minute of difference could mean the loss of vital evidence. Marcus, watching the controlled chaos unfold, thought about how it had all started with a simple cab ride on a blizzardy night. Now he was at the center of one of the biggest anti-fraud operations in Medicare history. "We've got Rachel Morrison," an agent announced over the radio, "found trying to board a private flight to the Bahamas." The news was greeted with a moment of tense silence. In the command room, the first big domino had fallen. In the hospital council, Dorothy was continuing her meticulously planned presentation when federal agents entered the room. Howard Phillips tried to escape through the back door, only to find more agents waiting. "How could you, Dorothy?" he shouted as he was handcuffed. "We were a family." "Families don't steal from helpless old people," replied Dorothy, her voice laden with decades of restrained indignation. The operation revealed the true extent of the scam: more than $200 million embezzled from Medicare, dozens of corrupt public officials, and thousands of exploited seniors. But it also exposed something unexpected: a network of doctors and nurses who had been secretly documenting the fraud, waiting for the right moment to blow the whistle. Jennifer Reese, watching the news of the arrest of her former bosses on the hospital TV, finally allowed herself to smile. "It was worth it," she told Marcus, who had come to visit her. "Every moment of fear, every threat was worth it." Marcus's free transportation program, initially a cover for the investigation, had become a national model. Other cities were beginning to implement similar systems, creating a safety net for vulnerable patients. "This is just the beginning," Dorothy said during a press conference a week after the arrests. "We're going to rebuild the medical transportation system from scratch with transparency and humanity as fundamental principles." Marcus found himself reflecting on his journey as he drove through Cleveland on a quiet afternoon. His old cab was still stored in the garage, a reminder of the man he used to be. Now driving one of the program's vans, he realized that his mission had become much bigger than himself. An elderly woman he was transporting that afternoon held his hand as he got out of the vehicle. "You're not just taking us to the doctors," she said, her eyes watering. "You're giving us back our dignity." The impact of the operation continued to reverberate around the country. Legislative reforms were proposed, auditing systems were strengthened, and a new era of transparency began in the medical transportation sector. Marcus was invited to testify before Congress, sharing his experience and helping to shape new patient protection policies. Sandra, who had become an expert in detecting fraud in the healthcare system, began training teams in other states. "Every number on a spreadsheet is a life," she always said in her seminars. Never forget that. Dorothy Wilson expanded the program to all the hospitals in her network, transforming it into an independent foundation dedicated to ensuring safe and dignified medical transportation for vulnerable patients. Marcus was appointed executive director, a position he accepted with humility and determination. One particularly cold morning a year after the start of the operation, Marcus found an envelope on his desk. Inside was an old photo, him helping Dorothy Wilson into her cab on that fateful night. On the back, a simple message: "Sometimes the greatest act of justice begins with the smallest act of kindness." The snow was starting to fall on Cleveland again, but this time Marcus wasn't worried about the cold. He knew his vans were on the streets, his drivers were trained, and his patients were safe. The system he had helped build would continue to work, protecting those who needed it most. "Ready for another day?" asked Sandra, entering his office with 2 cups of coffee. "Always," he replied, watching the blue dots move on the digital map on the wall, each one representing a promise fulfilled, a life impacted, a story of hope in motion. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the building the warmth of compassion and justice kept everyone warm, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the simplest gestures.